Hundreds of everyday household items are about to get a lot more expensive.
Whatever they tariff us, other countries, we will tariff them. That's reciprocal, back and forth. We'll also take historic action to dramatically expand production of critical minerals. Our country doesn't have much raw earth.
Really strategic reserves of minerals that the U.S. doesn't have a lot of.
This is a president who doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk.
What if I told you that the United States, the very country that built its global power on steel, coal, and energy, was suddenly brought to its knees by the very resources it once dominated? Imagine entire mining towns falling silent overnight, workers sent home with no paychecks, and factories scrambling for the raw materials that keep America running. This isn't some distant scenario. It's happening right now. A shocking tariff war has triggered chaos in the heart of U.S. industry, and the fallout is spreading fast. From gold and copper to rare earth minerals, the lifeblood of modern technology, America's supply chains are unraveling in real time. Prices are surging, production lines are stalling, and consumers are about to feel the pain in ways they never expected. But here's the twist that no one saw coming. While Washington fumbles, another nation is quietly stepping in to seize control. And it's not China. It's not Russia. It's actually one of America's oldest allies, Canada. Ottawa has turned this U.S. crisis into its greatest opportunity in decades, positioning itself as the new powerhouse of North American mining. The real question is, how did the United States, with all its resources and influence, lose its grip so fast? And is this the beginning of a permanent shift in global power? The first tremor hit without warning. In a single announcement, President Trump doubled tariffs on a wide range of imported metals, calling it a matter of national security. What he framed as a bold move to protect American jobs instantly sent shockwaves through global markets. Gold prices shot up to record highs, copper spiked, and investors scrambled to make sense of the chaos. For a brief moment, it looked like the U.S. might hold the upper hand. But then, the panic set in. Copper, the backbone of electronics and infrastructure, plunged after fears of shortages collided with collapsing demand. Commodity markets whiplashed, and industries braced for the fallout. The impact wasn't abstract, it was immediate. Automakers warned that the cost of steel and aluminum would send car prices soaring. Electronics companies sounded alarms over supply shortages. Even Swiss gold bars, long considered untouchable symbols of stability, were suddenly caught in the tariff crossfire. Behind the numbers, one fact became clear. America's industrial base was being pushed into crisis. The tariffs that were supposed to bring security were now ripping through the economy like a storm. And as Washington doubled down, the stage was set for a showdown that would leave U.S. mining towns reeling, and Canada preparing to strike. Within weeks of the tariff shock, America's mining heartlands went eerily quiet. In Arizona, the copper pits that once roared with machinery shut down overnight. West Virginia's coal fields, once the pride of steel production, saw their trains sit motionless on the tracks. And in Nevada, rare earth operations that were supposed to free the U.S. from foreign dependence slammed to a halt. Thousands of workers were suddenly sent home. Heavy machinery stood idle, gathering dust. Processing plants went dark, and entire communities that had survived on mining for generations found themselves cut off from their lifeline. The fallout wasn't just local, it spread fast. For industries, the disruption was brutal. Automakers scrambled as steel and aluminum prices climbed. Electronics manufacturers warned that copper shortages would hit production within weeks. Even home builders saw the cost of a single house jump by thousands of dollars, as rising material costs filtered into the market. And here's the chilling part. this wasn't just about factories or big corporations. Everyday Americans were about to feel the squeeze in their wallets. From cars and smartphones to refrigerators and power tools, prices were already climbing. What looked like a technical trade war on paper had turned into a very real crisis in living rooms across the country. But the deeper shock was still ahead. Because the collapse of these mines wasn't just temporary. It threatened to reshape America's economic backbone in ways few were prepared for. The collapse of America's mines didn't just hit the workers underground. It rippled through entire towns like a slow-moving earthquake. Cafes that once filled with miners on their lunch breaks now sat half-empty. Hardware stores saw their shelves gathering dust as paychecks disappeared. Even the local car dealerships, once buzzing with weekend sales, stood quiet, with rows of unsold trucks baking under the sun. In Nevada, families who had relied on rare earth mining for decades suddenly wondered how they'd pay their mortgages. In Wyoming, rail yards that once thundered with coal shipments now stood silent, forcing trucking companies, equipment suppliers, and even contractors out of business. For many of these communities, mining wasn't just an industry, it was their identity. And now, that identity was slipping away. The pain didn't stop at households. Schools that relied on mining taxes warned of staff layoffs and program cuts. Local banks grew nervous, tightening credit as businesses teetered on the edge. County budgets shrank overnight, forcing officials to make impossible choices between public services and survival. And here's the cruel reality. Even if Washington reversed its policies tomorrow, the damage wouldn't vanish. Restarting a mine isn't like flipping a switch. Laid-off workers move on, machinery rusts, and supply chains crumble. Bringing these sites back online could take months, or even years. By then, the world would have moved on. But while America's mining belt was being hollowed out, someone else was already moving to claim the prize. And what happened next would leave Washington stunned. As the crisis deepened, the silence from America's mines grew too loud to ignore. Governors in states like Arizona, Nevada, and West Virginia sounded the alarm. With tax revenues collapsing and jobs vanishing by the thousands, they demanded immediate action from Washington. On Capitol Hill, lawmakers from both parties began breaking ranks. Some argued that the tariffs had backfired catastrophically, turning allies into rivals and handing the mineral markets to foreign competitors. Others doubled down, insisting that America had to endure the pain to protect its sovereignty. The debate was fierce, but one truth was undeniable. The United States was bleeding leverage in the global resource race. Behind closed doors, pressure mounted on the White House. Industry leaders warned that America's entire supply chain, from defense manufacturing to consumer electronics, was at risk of collapse. Economists cautioned that the longer the standoff dragged on, the more permanent the damage would become. And yet, Washington stood firm. The tariffs stayed in place. The administration insisted that America could rebuild its mining industry on its own terms, no matter how much it cost. But while politicians argued, the ground was already shifting. Because across the northern border, Canada was making moves that would turn America's crisis into its own opportunity. While U.S. mines sat idle, Canada wasted no time stepping into the vacuum. In Ontario, nickel production surged as new contracts were signed almost weekly. In British Columbia, copper trucks rumbled day and night, feeding smelters that were now working at full tilt. And in Quebec, gold and iron ore fields expanded output, locking in buyers from Europe and Asia who had once looked exclusively to the United States. The timing couldn't have been better for Ottawa. With trade agreements already in place, like Canada's deal with the European Union and its membership in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Canadian minerals entered foreign markets tariff-free. That gave them a price edge the U.S. couldn't match, especially as American metals were saddled with heavy duties. And global buyers noticed. Still stung from years of supply chain instability, many corporations saw Canada as the safer bet. Long-term contracts that would have gone to American suppliers just months earlier were now being signed with Canadian firms. With every new deal, Canada quietly cemented its place as a reliable global supplier. The contrast couldn't have been starker. In Sudbury, Ontario, long known as Canada's nickel capital, massive ore trucks roared down the roads, smelters glowed, and exports soared. Meanwhile, across the border in Arizona, silence filled the once bustling copper pits. Canada was no longer just a supportive partner in North America's mining industry. It was on its way to becoming the new powerhouse. And what Ottawa did next would send an even bigger shock through Washington. Canada's sudden rise wasn't just about filling America's short-term gaps. It was about rewriting the future of critical minerals. Ottawa recognized that this was more than a trade dispute. It was a once-in-a-generation chance to claim global dominance in resources that power everything from smartphones to fighter jets. Rare earth elements became the centerpiece of this strategy. While the U.S. had long dreamed of building its own refining industry, Canada quietly began pouring resources into developing exactly that. New projects in Quebec and Ontario aimed not just to mine rare earths, but to refine them on Canadian soil, turning raw ore into the high-value materials desperately needed by tech and defense companies worldwide. Even more ambitious was Canada's plan to import raw, rare earth ore from allies like Australia, refine it at home, and then export the finished product to global markets. If successful, this would make Canada the Western Hemisphere's undisputed hub for rare earths, leapfrogging the United States and locking in decades of influence over supply chains. The ripple effects went far beyond minerals. Countries in Europe and Asia, once heavily dependent on U.S. supply lines, now looked northward. Trade deals were struck, partnerships deepened, and Ottawa's reputation as a reliable supplier gave it an edge Washington could no longer guarantee. And in a world where control over resources means control over power, the balance was shifting. For decades, the U.S. used its dominance in energy and raw materials to project influence around the globe. But now, Canada was quietly positioning itself as the new gatekeeper of the minerals that fuel the future. The United States had started a trade war to strengthen itself. Instead, it may have handed its closest ally the keys to a new kind of global power. Even if Washington reversed course tomorrow, the scars of this crisis wouldn't fade overnight. Mines don't roar back to life with the flip of a switch. Skilled workers who lost their jobs have already moved on. Machinery left idle is slipping into disrepair, and global buyers have signed long-term contracts with Canada that won't be abandoned easily. Infrastructure tells the same story. Canada is building new rail links, port terminals, and refining facilities to handle its booming exports. These investments will operate for decades, locking in new trade patterns that leave the U.S. on the outside looking in. By the time America even begins to restart its mines, Canada could be years ahead, holding on to markets that used to be dominated by its southern neighbor. And then there's the bigger danger: manufacturing. With minerals in short supply, U.S. companies may start shifting factories overseas to countries with more reliable access to resources. That means fewer jobs at home, slower growth, and a steady erosion of the industrial strength America once took for granted. The longer this drags on, the clearer the picture becomes. This isn't just about tariffs or temporary shortages. It's about whether the United States can remain a manufacturing powerhouse in the age of electric cars, renewable energy, and high-tech devices. Because without secure access to copper, nickel, and rare earths, even the most ambitious industries can grind to a halt. Canada, once the junior partner, is seizing the future. The United States, for the first time in generations, risks losing control over the very materials that power modern life. But the biggest question remains: has Washington already lost too much ground, or is there still a narrow chance to reclaim its place before the shift becomes permanent? America's gamble was meant to show strength. Instead, it exposed weakness. What started as a push to protect U.S. mines spiraled into shuttered communities, soaring prices, and the loss of trust from global partners. And while Washington argued over politics, Canada quietly seized the moment, locking in contracts, expanding infrastructure, and stepping onto the world stage as a resource superpower. This isn't just a trade dispute, it's a turning point. For decades, the United States relied on its dominance in energy and raw materials to fuel its industries and project influence across the globe. But now, that foundation is cracking. Every month that passes cements Canada's role as the new supplier of choice, while America risks falling further behind. So the question isn't just whether the U.S. can reopen its mines, it's whether it can regain the trust, the leverage, and the time it needs to recover. Because once supply chains shift, they rarely shift back. The clock is ticking, and history may look back on this moment not as a stumble, but as the day North America's balance of power quietly moved north.